Hi everyone. Today we're going to be discussing assessment of understanding and inquiry. This is the lecture on how to assess science lessons. And so today we're going to tackle assessment and the next generation science standards, which are the standards our Louisiana science standards are based off of, how to create creative assessments, and the pros and cons of using traditional assessments. So before we get started, we discussed backwards design last class in the 5E lesson plan. And something we need to know is before we can even start designing our lesson, we need to identify our learning outcomes. And then from our learning outcomes, then we identify our assessment plan and then the learning activities, which are those super fun, explore and engage and elaborate. And then we decide what content our students need to know to do those learning activities. So before you can even figure out what to teach, you need to know what to assess first, which directly involves your learning outcomes. So when you're designing your assessments for your 5E lesson plans in science, please make sure that they directly meet your learning outcomes for that lesson. You all should be aware that there's formative versus summative assessment. Formative assessment is checking the execution of the plan. Are students doing what they're intended to do that day? Are students learning science practice or core ideas? And that could be through things like class discussion, doing the thumbs up, thumbs down, worksheets, low-stake quizzes, bell ringers, and exit tickets. So those are the things that we do on a daily basis. And many of your scripted lesson plans have a formative assessment for each lesson. Your summative assessment is what did the students learn? So did they learn what I intended to teach them? And the purpose of a summative assessment is usually for grading, placement, information for parents, and for next year's teachers. So usually we think of summative assessments as exams, final projects, essays, and final presentations. And summative assessments are almost always going to be at the end of the unit. Now, if you remember when I introduced you to the next generation science standards, which are in fact almost identical to the Louisiana science standards, we discussed three-dimensional learning. So every single science standard has a science and engineering practice, a core idea, and a cross-cutting concept. And when I mean core idea, I mean disciplinary core idea or DCI. And so if we are going to assess these new science standards, then we need to assess all three parts of that standard. Now that sounds really complicated, right? But it's actually really simple. So I give you an example of multiple assessments for one Louisiana science standard. So if we focus specifically on, and this is an example of teaching a unit where you see that there are 3 Louisiana science standards in that unit, we're going to focus on wave properties for 4th grade and specifically 4-PS4-1, develop a model of waves to describe patterns in terms of amplitude and wavelength, and that waves can cause objects to move. Now, with that particular Louisiana science standard, the science and engineering practices are developing and using models, constructing explanations, and designing solutions. And for the disciplinary core ideas, we want our students to know about wave properties. And for the cross-cutting concepts, we want our students to understand patterns and cause and effect. So how the heck do we make sure that we assess all 3 dimensions of this Louisiana state standard? Well, we can just break down the standards. So the first one is develop a model to make sense of wave behavior. And so what we can do is we can figure out how to create a formative assessment for our students developing and using a model. And that could be as simple as your students taking a rope and creating a wave with it. It could be putting bowls of water in the classroom or tanks of water and creating waves, or purchasing a wave machine for those tanks. And so that would be an easy way to assess a model. And the next is describing relationships among components of the wave model. So you can see they tell you that they want you to describe patterns in terms of amplitude and wavelength. So we can then have our students analyze and interpret data to identify the difference in amplitude, which is the height of the wave, and the wavelength or spacing between wave and peaks. And again, we can create a formative assessment for that. So maybe you give them charts of different waves. This could be radio signal waves. It could be EKG waves, like of your heart. It could be change in wave patterns in the atchafalaya. So there could be a whole bunch of different ways. And then the last part of the Louisiana Standard is also that waves can cause objects to move. So we want our students to be able to explain how waves can make an object move. So interestingly, when you put an object in the ocean, you see that the water goes up and down, but that object, for example, a rubber ducky, doesn't actually move forward or backwards. There's no net motion in direction. And so you could show them a phenomenon of a rubber ducky or a boat or a leaf floating in a wave pool and ask them to explain or construct an explanation about why it hasn't moved. Now, when the water actually meets the beach, that's when we actually do see objects move. And so then you could create a summative assessment where you can assess all these various parts of it when you ask students why an object moves when the waves meet the beach. So that's one way that you can break down the Louisiana Science Standard into each type of assessment to meet each part of that standard. So each dimension of the standard is met. Let's talk about creative ways to assess your students, and we will practice some of these ways next week in class. The first one is prompt and rubric, then we'll discuss performance assessment, portfolios, science conferences with children's self-assessment, and concept mapping. So the first one is called prompt and rubric. What you do is you provide a prompt or question or group of questions that include statements about a task to be done along with directions on how to do it. And then you walk around asking these formative questions, and you have scoring criteria that should be used when assessing the child's performance. And you pre-figure out that rubric. So you don't come up with the rubric right then and there. You have one that's already created. So here's an example of a prompt. In first grade, your students are going to learn about sound, and that sound are caused by vibrations. So the performance objective could be give students a quote-unquote drum and a pencil and a piece of rice, and have students hit the drum with the pencil and then with the rice on the drum. So this could be your prompt and rubric. This drum is made of a bowl and plastic wrap. Please tap the drum with your pencil eraser. What do you see and hear? Now sprinkle rice on the drum and do it again. And then you can go around and ask your students, what do you observe when you hit the drum with an eraser? What do you think causes sound? And then you have a grading rubric here, where if a student answers it correctly, they would describe what was observed, including the plastic moving up and down, and that something like vibrations causes sound. If a student kind of gets it, they might describe one correct observation. And if the student does not understand the concept, then no response is given or an incorrect response are given. What you can do is quickly highlight or check off what each group of students answers, and then you can quickly assess if your students understand this concept or not. Performance assessment. So inquiry involves descriptive models, explanatory models, and experimental models, as well as science practices like carrying out investigations and then planning investigations. And we've all discussed how inquiry is a process. So assessment also needs to happen over an extended amount of time because the assessment needs to be a process. So what I would do is observe and document student practices while they're engaged in doing science. So what you do is you assess students based on observations of students as they demonstrate a specific task or problem-solving skill. So for example, we dissected owl pellets last week. And while dissecting those owl pellets, I was walking around observing what the students were doing and making sure they were staying on task. And many of the students would say, hey, Dr. H, look at this cool bone I found. And we would look at the bone and I would ask them various formative assessment questions, like where do you think the animal, that part of the body is? And then I would ask them to take that bone and look at their chart and ask them what specific bone they think they might have and what animal it might belong to help them along with their inquiry process. Now this was really helpful because one, I could see how the students were dissecting the owl pellets, I could see their thought process, and we could start moving forward with identifying the actual organisms in the owl pellets and seeing if they were capable of identifying the specific bones that they were dissecting and what organism it belonged to. Here's another example of a performance assessment. We've talked a bunch about the standard where we identify what plants need to grow. So the topic is lights and plants. And so the engagement is what will happen if Mrs. Cortez plants are kept in the closet without light. And then for exploration, the students will get 2 plants, and they have 1 week to find out what will happen to the plants if they're kept in a closet without light. And so what they have to do is they have to make a prediction that they can test, describe how they're going to test their prediction, and then carry out the test and make observations of their plants. And at the end of the test, they're going to state their results. And then the explanation part is going to be students describing whether their evidence supports their hypothesis or predictions or does not support their prediction. And this is the scoring guide or rubric for the performance assessment. So the teacher can look at, did they create a testable prediction? Can they test the prediction? So can they, does it imply that there's a control and variables? And then are they actually doing their daily observations? Are they making daily entries? Are they creating their drawings and labeling them? And are their observations accurate? And then can they actually describe their results and make them consistent with their observations? And then the explanation would be students who relate that the presence of light is necessary for Mrs. Riley's plants or Cortez's plants to live. So this could be a way that you do a performance assessment on your students. Another great tool that you can use are portfolios. These are organized collections of students' work representing the best that he or she can do. We all create portfolios in student education, and we start those early on in your career so that you can see your own growth. Portfolio as a whole can illustrate a student's progress, which is really awesome for students to reflect on and see. They're also great tools for back-to-school nights and parent-teacher conferences. What might you include in a portfolio could be drawings, charts, and graphs that are the products of hands-on discovery-focused activities. It could be reaction pieces, such as written responses to videos, field trips, or virtual labs. It could be excerpts of science journal pages. And it could also be media products, like did the student create a PowerPoint or a Prezi or a video about what they are learning. It could also contain a dictionary of science vocabulary and creative stories where they need to use their science vocabulary. One assessment that I really love, but I also understand can be very difficult to conduct, and I know your students would love this assessment as well, is the science conference with children. And so what you do, and this is the quickest and most reliable way to find out if children are learning, is you sit on the floor or at that child's level and you talk to them in a cheerful tone so they understand they're not getting fussed at, because usually when we're at their level and we're talking to them, we're fussing them. And you inform the child why they get this special time with you. So you sit with them and you say, so I really want to know what you've learned so far from doing all these science experiments. And then you let them speak using terms they are used to using. So you're going to allow your child to code switch, but this is also a great time to encourage the use of science vocabulary. So if you guys are discussing a lab where students are learning what causes a seed to germinate, and the student says, so we wanted to know how to make a seed grow into a plant, you can say, that's right. Do you remember the science term for that? And if they say, no, I can't remember, you can kindly remind them that the term is germination, and you can get them to start practicing using that term. And then you use open-ended questions like, tell me about what you did in this experiment or what you predicted. And then you can ask them things like, what did you think about when making these predictions? How did you feel about the results or outcome of this experiment? What if you were to not put any water in the seed? Do you think it would still germinate? Is there another way to explain that? If you were to do this experiment again, what would you change next time? And then you can also ask the student what questions you should ask the next student. Now, this is a really awesome way to assess your students. Unfortunately, it's difficult to do, especially with a class of 28 students. However, I would recommend that you at least try it. Another one are science notebooks or journals. So I'm a big proponent of these. You can purchase composition books for 88 cents at the drugstore. If Dirt Cheap or another discount store comes back online after Ida, you can sometimes buy composition books, you know, those black and white swirly books, for a nickel. And this notebook is devoted only to science. And what's great is you can use it to hit on metacognition. So you can include things like formal investigation information. What was the procedure, the data, and the results collected? But you can also include informal things like the daily questions, the predictions the students make, and the reflections, and then what their feeling is about in science. And you can make it super fun. You can have students decorate the cover of the notebook. You can create a science dictionary in the back. For your older students, they could have a table of contents. For your younger students, you might have them have some sort of template that they use. So maybe there's an 8x5 template that they fill out and they cut and paste into the notebook each week. And then on the back page, they can draw out their predictions or put their charts in and things like that. And I would encourage you to use the notebook by providing some guiding questions like, what confused you the most? What surprised you the most? And at the end of the unit, you can have your students share with each other and you what they wrote or drew in their journals. And again, similar to the portfolios, you can use the notebooks during parent-teacher conferences as work examples. And also, it's a great way for you to quickly scan their notebooks and see if they're understanding what you're supposed to be doing in class. And it also makes science feel special because it's a special notebook just for their science. Another one is science probes. This is similar to prompts and rubrics, and we're going to practice these, and you're going to actually go through a whole bunch of probes next week and decide if there's one that might fit your science lessons. But the probe itself is a question that seeks a two-part answer. The first part is the lower end thinking, such as identification and naming. So think low-level blooms, understanding, defining. And then the second part is going to be higher end thinking by stating rules or relationships among elements of the lesson. So that would be a higher level of blooms, like evaluating or analyzing some information. So again, like I said, I will go over science probes next week. Another thing you can do is have your children self-assess themselves. We do this a lot with thumbs up and thumbs down and whiteboards. Kids will naturally assess themselves constantly, so reminding your students what they did and asking, so what have you learned so far? What was easy to grasp? What was harder to understand? And doing various activities like that as exit tickets can be very helpful, so you have a better idea of how your students are feeling about science and you can encourage growth mindset around this subject. And the last one is concept mapping. This is another method that we are going to practice in class next week. Concept maps are a diagram that represents knowledge by identifying basic concepts and topics and showing you how they are related. And like I said, we're going to do one in class. These are great for English as second language learners, as well as incorporating vocab into a lesson, because they are very visual and you can have your students use vocabulary to link various concepts. You can also use it as a unit planning device, and I can show you guys how to do that next week as well. So some more on concept mapping. The node is the shape that contains a word or phrase. So you can see here the nodes are red or orange. And then the link is the line with an arrowhead either at one end or both ends that's used to connect the nodes and show relationships. And so again, you can use pictures, you can use vocabulary, you could use videos to create these concept maps. And you can also create virtual concept maps, which might be great for the older kids, but you can also give the students cutouts and pictures and then have them draw the lines, or maybe you draw the lines and as a whole class create a concept map if you have younger learners. Now let's talk about evaluating some traditional assessment strategies. There are pros and cons to traditional assessments, particularly when assessing inquiry. So the traditional assessments we're going to discuss are end of chapter assignments, quizzes, end of unit test, research reports, activity write-ups, and standardized tests. So the first one is end of chapter assignments. Basically, we're assessing, did your students remember what they read? So what does it accomplish? It makes your students read to at least find the answers, which we see a lot, particularly in high school science curriculum. So it's testing reading comprehension. A lot of times we use this as homework so parents see that students are learning science. And if not done, you can meet with students and parents to discuss why they're not doing their work. But what it doesn't accomplish is it doesn't tell you what your students know, and it doesn't tell you if your students actually understand the material or if they like it. So if you choose to do some sort of end of chapter assignment, I would tell you how to use it effectively, and that you tell your students why you're assigning it. So you can tell them, these questions at the end of the chapter help you apply what we went over and should help you prepare for whatever examination is coming up. And give your students a few minutes in class to start it and ask you questions, because most students are more likely to complete something that they started in class than if you expect them to just start it cold as homework. Now here's a crazy idea. What if instead of you doing end of chapter assignments, you teach students how to take notes or fill out a study guide, and then they have that to study instead of doing these questions. And you could even use these end of chapter questions for parts of those study guides. Another one is quizzes. These take a little time. They're quick assessment of if students remember or understand information or concepts. So what they accomplish is, can your students think fast and write their answers out correctly or select the right answer? They're easy to grade, and they do provide a snapshot of student recall. What they don't accomplish is there's not much about in-depth understanding. Right? You can't have your students write an essay question as a quiz. And we're a deficit in knowledge or ability to get the correct answer down on paper in time. So if your students have a learning disability, an IEP, quizzes might be really tough for them, especially if you're only giving your students 5 minutes to write down the answer. If you choose to use them, don't let them take away from the science experience. Use them in moderation and keep them short and very focused on the important ideas or concepts of the lessons. So always keep in mind the learning objective that you're trying to meet with that quiz. It might be them matching the science terms to the correct definition. But wouldn't it be even cooler if they could write a sentence using those terms instead? We're all familiar with the end of unit tests. Most of us use these as summative assessments. They're usually short answer and multiple choice questions. Essays should be how science activities were conducted and what they learned from them. What do they accomplish? They accomplish who's a good test taker. You can compare students to one another in progress. You can create tests with less recall and more reasoning. And you can have students do things like analyze data or look at graphs on a test. What they don't accomplish is they're not going to motivate students to think science is cool or how well students can express themselves. Now, we all know that we have to use end of unit tests at our schools. So if you're going to use them effectively. Make sure to vary the test items and make sure that they are directly linked to the learning objectives from the lesson in the unit. Consider the order of questions. I'm a big proponent, particularly with our younger learners, that you start with easier questions and you build up the difficulty. That way, when they see those easier questions, it's going to build their confidence and their stamina for when they get to those more difficult questions where they really need to think about it or explain something. How many of us have taken a test where you get a really hard question as one of the first 3 questions on the exam and you automatically want to shut down and give up? And we don't want that for our students. And also make sure that your questions are not all recall. You want to use various levels of Bloom. Another great summative assessment are research reports or lab reports. What they are they're basically lab reports with a little extra in them. These are for older grades. We're talking 5th and 6th graders. And they help students explain and connect the hands-on activities they did in class to real-world situations and problem solving. So to use these effectively, you have to relate what they are learning to their own world. So they need to solve a problem they are familiar with. And some of you all have come up with some really great lesson plans for this. For example, you might give them an example of an environment that they are living in and ask what adaptations would help them survive. if they were to live in, let's say, a desert environment or an aquatic environment. You need to make your expectations clear and your grading rubric available for these particular research reports. Please consider your English as second language learners and dyslexic students who might get easily confused. There's not going to be a lot of contextual clues and visuals in these types of assignments. And if you plan on creating research reports or lab reports, I highly recommend that you scaffold them. So start small at the beginning of the year and build, similar to how I taught you all lesson planning and social studies. So have them build that research report probably with the first 2 science units that you teach, so that by the 3rd or 4th unit, they understand the expectations and they can start working on them on their own. For your younger learners, you can do activity write-ups. So this is a great way to get your students up to creating lab reports or research reports. So for your younger learners, you can have your students draw or write what equipment they use, what did they do, and what their results were. And this could be a great sheet that they put in their science notebooks. And then finally, standardized tests. So if you teach grades 3rd grade and up, your students will be tested on science through the LEAP exam. This is not in any book. When you get into your classroom next year, please take a look at the LEAP questions that are posted under the Louisiana Science Standards. You need to prepare your students for the testing environment and the types of questions they will be exposed to. So if they are taking the LEAP exam on the computer, they should probably take their summative exams on the computer. If the LEAP exam requires a CER, you should require CERs on your exam. You also need to learn how to manage your stress. Walking into a school during LEAP testing, the anxiety level is palatable. You can just tell that everybody is on edge. And students are going to read your body language and they are going to pick up very quickly if you yourself are stressed out. And then you also have to manage the classroom anxiety level. Do a lot of fun stuff during LEAP exams. Get your students excited for the LEAP exam. When you're reviewing for the LEAP exam, do really cool things. You can do quiz bowls. You can do Jeopardy games. You can provide them with example questions in a fun way for analyzing data and looking at pictures. I would definitely tell you right now that you should use those Page-Keeley probes to review for the LEAP exam, because many of the LEAP exam questions look very familiar to those probes in the sense that they get a picture or they get a scenario, and then from that picture scenario, your students then have to answer questions with the knowledge of the science concept they learned in your class. And finally, when considering the assessments you're going to use, please be very intentional. Don't just pick a quiz to pick a quiz. Don't just do Kahoot to do a Kahoot or a Nearpod. Think very carefully about how each assessment that you are choosing is going to meet the learning objective of that lesson, and how it's also going to help your students understand the science and help you understand where they may be deficient in their knowledge base. Please assess often, because science is a process, and so you need to assess a process, and so the assessment should be a process as well. Thank you all so much. I hope you guys have a great week, and I can't wait to see you all next week when we do some more hands-on science.